Hi everyone, and welcome to this quick Godot tutorial where we're gonna talk about static assets in Godot. Just before we dive in, I want to give a big shout out to A.O. Bertois. He's actually the member of the community that suggested this topic, so if you want to suggest topics too, feel free to drop a comment down below. And with that said, let's dive in and talk about static assets in Godot. Alright, so first things first, let's see how to actually import an asset in a Godot project. That's actually quite simple. You just need to drag it from a file explorer and into the file system doc in the editor's layout that is in the bottom left corner. This usually works, and then your asset is instantly imported. However, sometimes you might discover that it doesn't really work. And that's because, as explained in the docs, this system doesn't work for all types of assets. Basically, it's just made for the resources. So some extra files like data stuff might not work directly. And in that case, you actually just need to open your file explorer and copy the file in the file explorer instead of dragging it in the Godot editor. Okay, now let's say that you've imported your resources in your Godot project and you want to check that they're properly configured. Then you should have a look at the Imports panel, which is this little tab next to this Scene Hierarchy panel. In here you get various options that you can change, and that of course depend on the type of resource that you're importing, and even the file format. For example, an image and an audio clip will obviously not show the same options. The really essential thing to remember when you're importing stuff and changing the import settings is that when you've changed one or more options in your resource import, you absolutely need to click the Re-import button at the bottom. If you don't, then as soon as you select another asset in your project, all your modifications will be lost. And Godot doesn't show any confirm pop-up or anything, so you have to be careful to actually click the button quite often. But other than that, you get all the typical options of a game asset importer. Also, for some file types like 3D models or audio clips to some extent, you actually have even more advanced import editors that you can access by double-clicking on your resource in the file system doc or clicking on the advanced option in the import panel. These extra pop-up windows contain some info on the resource and some extra configuration options. And they can even have some tools to directly edit your resource a bit and make it better suited to the project at hand without having to actually create a new version in an external software. So that's pretty cool in terms of prototyping and having a really quick workflow. Now, of course, Godot supports all the usual types of assets, so it has images, audio, and 3D models. But actually there's also something quite cool that I haven't seen in other game engines so far, which is a direct built-in game translation system, where you just import a file with key value pairs for the different texts to translate and the different languages to use. Those files can either be in the PO format or a simple multi-columns CSV file. And then you can directly use it in your game to add internationalization to your text or dialogues. But anyway, now that we have an idea of how imports basically work, let's discuss some specificities of Godot for each type of resource, so for the images, the audio clips, and the 3D models. Overall, importing images is fairly classic in Godot. The engine lets you import a variety of image formats, like JPEG, PNGs, or BMPs for example, but there are also a few formats that aren't available in all game engines, and that are worth pointing out. In Godot, you can import images in the WebP format. So WebP is for web picture. It's a really lightweight format that's used a lot on the web, as the name implies, and that actually supports transparency, like a PNG for example. You can also import basic SVGs, which is an interesting image format where everything is defined in mathematical formulas instead of actual pixels. So this means that you can directly upscale or downscale your image without losing any quality. But because it's kind of a weird format compared to the others, in Godot you can't actually import a very complex SVG file. So when you have a complex file, it's better to really turn it into a real pixel-based image, like a PNG for example, so that Godot can actually handle the contents of your image. To convert a SVG image to a PNG, you can use the really cool Inkscape software, which is a vector graphics editor that, among other things, can export SVGs to PNGs. And even better, it can actually do it directly from the command line. You can find more info on that in the description or in the written version of this tutorial. And finally, of course, there are some options for HDR and EXR files, which are HDR-compatible formats, meaning that in addition to the colors, you also have a concept of intensity, of energy, and so those are really useful whenever you have like sky textures or ambience. Basically, they're another way of lighting a scene, but based on an image. The rest of the input options is really just usual stuff, like compression mode, texture types, bitmaps, etc. And honestly, I think it's probably best that you just look at the page from the official docs, because I would just be like repeating everything that's over there, and it gives all the details on the input settings. In particular, it has this really nice table that sums up the advantages and drawbacks of each compression option, and it explains various caveats for using textures for 3D rendering. So be sure to have a look. If you see something strange with your textures and you're working in 3D, there might actually be some gotcha that you need to be aware of. And just a last passing remark, if you double-click on a texture in the file system doc and you look at it in the inspector, you'll get its actual size on the disk readily available in the bottom right corner of the thumbnail, which is really cool whenever you want to like eyeball whether some of your resources are just too heavy on the overall project. But okay, now that we've talked about images, let's talk about sounds. So again, Godot's a pretty good student here. Like many other software, it lets you use MP3, WAV or OGG audio files in your project. Now, I want to be super clear about something. Audio compression is a very complex topic, and in reality, when you take into account all the possible codecs and extensions and formats and everything, it becomes quite hard to chart which format is the best for what purpose. But assuming that you're in a normal situation, Godot actually gives pretty good tips to choose the right format depending on the type of audio file that you're making. WAV format is nice for short sound effects, so something like shooting a weapon or picking up a coin, or even a little contextual sound like when you select a unit in a strategy game and it answers to show you that it's been selected. All those are very short audio files that are pretty good in WAV format. OGG is better for long audio, so something like ambient music or speeches, for example. And MP3 is interesting when you have a lower tier CPU, like on the web or on a smartphone. And you need to have a format that is lightweight during playback to be able to stack all of your game sounds at the same time without the whole game just exploding instantly. But all that being said, truth is, you should basically just prepare your project assets in a somewhat reasonable way, and then benchmark your project to see where the real problems are and what resources are way too heavy for what they're doing in the game. Never forget that, be it for images or sounds, you have to do a trade-off between quality and efficiency. However, there are still some best practices for keeping your audio resources light and cool in your project early on, such as making as many audios as you can mono, cause a stereo audio is double the size because of the second channel, and actually if you're importing a WAV file in Godot, you can do this directly in the engine thanks to this import setting, without even having to re-edit your file itself in some external software. Alright, and now time to finally dig into some slightly more complex stuff. Cause for 3D models, Godot has some specificities compared to other big game engines like Unity or Unreal Engine, for example, most notably in the file formats that it supports or doesn't support. So if you look at the official doc about importing 3D scenes, which is Godot's way of saying importing a 3D model, you see that it can handle 4 basic formats and 1 native format. Now, if you're a bit familiar with using 3D models in other game engines, you'll recognize in this list some common formats, like OBJ or DAE. But there are also a few things that might surprise you. In particular, the fact that blend scenes can directly be used inside of Godot, no intermediate export required. Or that the engine supports GLTF and GLB, or even more surprising, that the engine does not support FBX. That last point is to me the real big thing here, cause nowadays a lot of 3D model packages contain the object in FBX format. Sometimes it's among other formats, and sometimes it's the only one that you've got. In particular, if you've gotten some assets from the Unity Asset Store, cause that's definitely one of the main ways I've personally seen people share their 3D models. It's in the FBX format. Now, the reason the FBX format is so used is because it's quite powerful. It can bundle everything together, so you've got the mesh, the materials, the textures, and even the animations all in one file, and it's compatible with a lot of common game creation software, from 3D digital creation tools like Autodesk Maya or Blender to game engines like Unity or Unreal Engine. So then, why does Godot frown upon this great format? Well, as explained in this post, it's basically because of the philosophy and the legality of the FBX format. Cause to put it simply, FBX is a proprietary format from Autodesk, which therefore requires relying on a proprietary SDK to properly integrate it in your engine. And Godot's not fond of this proprietary mentality, which is why they preferred to turn to GLTF, an open 3D exchange format that is way more aligned with their free and open source mentality. Now, it's worth noting that here I'm talking about Godot 4 because actually in Godot 3, as mentioned here, they tried to reverse engineer some way of importing FBX, but they kind of think it's not that reliable, so they've decided to just say right off the bat they won't be doing FBX directly. But of course, at the same time, Godot can't say it's just completely banning all FBX models from Godot projects, because it's still one of the go-to formats for 3D data exchange today. So they've actually implemented a workaround using the FBX to GLTF plugin. That's why if you open a project that contains some FBX files, or you try to import new ones in Godot 4, Godot will prompt you to install and/or reference the path of this SDK on your computer. So I personally think that if you already have like hundreds of packs with FBX models inside, this will probably be the better solution. But if you're still a bit new to all this, or if you want to start fresh with the old Godot mentality and open source philosophy and everything, you should definitely have a look at the GLTF format, because it's actually quite good and it works well with other open source tools like Blender. So it will avoid you and your teammates having to install an external tool in your Godot project and doing all those conversion steps every time you import a new 3D model asset. But anyway, here you go. You now know the basics of importing static assets in Godot. Of course, we didn't talk about more advanced notions like importing rigged and animated 3D models. But don't hesitate to drop a comment if you'd like a follow-up episode on that topic. And in the meantime, I hope you liked this tutorial and that it helped you navigate the Godot file formats, or perhaps even convert some of your old FBX assets into brand new GLTF resources. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like it and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next ones. And of course, don't hesitate to leave a comment with ideas of Godot tricks that you'd like to learn. As always, thanks a lot for watching and take care.